two colleagues of mine. One is a professor here at Hunter College in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies. Edgardo Meléndez has a distinguished career from the University of Puerto Rico, transferred to Hunter College a few years back, has written extensively on the topic that he will be discussing, and the presentation tonight is based on a journal article that of Centro journal that is either forthcoming or was published.
It's supposed to be forthcoming.
It's forthcoming. Here we go. And Carlos Vargas is my colleague, director of research at Centro, and he has also written extensively about the topic, the connection between migration and political participation and so forth. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce them. But I came tonight for another reason. I apologize in advance, I have to run to another event, in which I'm not a speaker, but actually a participant. In any case, tonight is the last event that our colleague Evelyn Collazo is going to be with us. I'd like to send her in a goodwill with a round of applause from all the people that appreciate her work over the last few years here at Centro. She's been kind of a pillar of all this event through the last few years, and it's our loss, and we wish her the best in her new career endeavors. And I just wanted to be here to be able to send you with a goodwill to your new ventures, okay? So now, with any further ado, Carlos, I think, who's going to start?
Edgardo.
So yes. Please welcome the speakers.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to Centro for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. My paper is called Transnational or Colonial, Puerto Rican Migration to the United States. I assume that if you're here, you are aware of the importance of migration to Puerto Ricans, both to those living in Puerto Rico and to those living in the United States. And I assume you have some interest in the topic too. You can argue, at least I do argue, that migration, along with colonialism and U.S. citizenship, is a determining factor in the history of Puerto Ricans. Again, Puerto Ricans both on the island and on the U.S. mainland. This, of course, raises an important question, at least an important question for people like us that try to think about this kind of issues. And that is, what is the nature of Puerto Rican migration to the United States? What can the movement of people from the island tell us, not only about Puerto Rican society and Puerto Rican history, but also about U.S. society and U.S. history. So for me, I find this issue about the nature of Puerto Rican migration a significant issue. I have been studying Puerto Rican migration for several years now, so most of what I will be saying here tonight reflects that research. There are different notions on what is migration, what is the significance or the nature of migration from Puerto Rico to the United States. The most widely used notion, by the way, was presented by the Puerto Rican government. And it's also presented by many scholars dealing with migration from Puerto Rico. And that is, migration is seen as the consequence of individual decisions, right? People decide to move on their own, right? Usually, this is related in terms of theories of migration to the so-called push and pull notion of migration, right? There are forces pushing people out, and there are forces pulling people in. But again, individual migration is the rational decision made by individuals, right, on their own. This was the policy of the Puerto Rican government. Although, as I shall explain, and possibly all of you know, after 1945, the Puerto Rican government played a very significant role in the movement of people from the island to the United States. So it had a double discourse, right? And at the same time that it was encouraging and organizing the movement of people out of the island, it was arguing that we are only helping those people that are interested in moving to the United States. Another important notion on the nature of migration from Puerto Rico to the United States is that presented by mostly U.S. scholars in the 1950s and 60s. The most significant scholars making this idea were Nathan Glaser and Patrick Moynihan in their widely known Beyond the Melting Pot. This is a landmark study where Glaser and Moynihan compare Puerto Ricans to other ethnic and racial groups in New York City. And basically, they argue that, well, Puerto Ricans are immigrants, right? But they are not like other, quote unquote, traditional immigrants, basically using the model of European immigrants, right? Their argument, by the way, taken from the Puerto Rican journey, is that Puerto Ricans are different from previous immigrants. They are different because they are from a different racial and cultural background. And the end consequence of this is that they are not well adapted for their incorporation into the United States. That unlike previous traditional immigrants, these people will not assimilate to American society. And of course, this has several consequences in terms of how do we understand migration and the policies related to that. In reaction to these two ideas or conceptions on migration, in the 1970s, the History Task Force of Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, presented a different interpretation of Puerto Rican migration, right? And it became a very important review and interpretation of migration from the island to the United States. Basically, Centro argued that Centro and Centro-related scholars like Fran Bonilla and Ricardo Campos, that Puerto Rican migration, like migrations in general, was a labor migration. It was determined by the transformations and logic of capitalism, right? And in that sense, it was no different from any other migration in the world, in the capitalist world economy. That is, specific characteristics of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, right? Like Puerto Rico being a colonial territory of the United States, like Puerto Ricans being colonial citizens of the United States, and including the significant role that the colonial state played in this migration. These elements were not generally taken into consideration. Most recently, a very important theory on migration has been adapted to the Puerto Rican case, and that is the idea that Puerto Rican migration is a transnational migration. And transnational theory and transnationalism has become a very significant theory and perspective on contemporary migrations to the United States. The most important scholar presenting this argument is, of course, the well-known anthropologist Jorge Duani. That is, Duani argues that Puerto Rican migration is one more kind of a transnational migration, although in later writings, like in Blurred Borders, he calls it a colonial transnational migration. Of course, Duani, being an anthropologist, emphasizes cultural and identity factors, but also Duani emphasizes the role that the colonial state played in migration. And of course, this is important because one of the most significant elements in the transnational literature is, of course, the role that homeland states played in the organization of migration to the host society, in this case, the United States, and the role that the homeland states played in the incorporation of the transnational immigrants. So basically, Duani argues that Puerto Rican migration is one more case, although a colonial one, it's one more case of a transnational migration. I argue that Puerto Rican migration has elements that resemble those of a transnational migration, but that it's better to understand it as a colonial migration. That is, the basis for the movement of people from the United States, from Puerto Rico, to the United States, it's the colonial relationship of the territory to the United States, the territorial or colonial nature of their U.S. citizenship, and that has defined migration from the island to the United States. By the way, I've made a table of the most important elements that characterize political transnationalism as they appear in the literature on transnationalism. And out of 9 elements, Puerto Rican migration has 8 of them. Right? You can find many elements of transnational migrations in the Puerto Rican case. For example, the role of the government, as I just mentioned, promotion of hometown organizations, organization of homeland political organizations in the whole society, the organization by the homeland state of structures in the whole society, in the Puerto Rican case, of course, the immigration division, the use of remittances by migrants and immigrant investments in the homeland, the importance of the context of reception and the impact of receiving state policies on immigrant incorporation, and the support for and the lobbying of homeland government policies in the host society, and also the protection by the homeland state of its citizens in the host society. There is one more element which is not significant in the Puerto Rican experience, and that has to do with citizenship. And that is, one important element in the transnational experience is, of course, the issue of dual citizenship and becoming U.S. citizens in the United States. So citizenship is an element that differentiates the Puerto Rican experience from transnational migrations. What I argue is that indeed, Puerto Rican migration has elements that resemble those of a transnational migration, but that is because of the specific construction of colonialism in Puerto Rico and the specific construction of U.S. citizenship in Puerto Rico. That is, Puerto Ricans do resemble in their migration experiences some elements of transnationalism, but that doesn't make it a transnational migration. That is, colonialism makes it look like a transnational migration. Now, Duani focuses on the role of the homeland government, of the Puerto Rican government, in sponsoring and organizing migration to the United States. And in this, he argues there is a resemblance, or he argues that it's one element that makes Puerto Rican migration comparable to transnational migrations. Now let me say a few things about this. Well, before I get to that, let me say a few things about colonialism and citizenship. Citizenship in Puerto Rico, U.S. citizenship in Puerto Rico, is what allows Puerto Ricans to move freely from the island to the United States. No transnational migration has that experience, right? This is a consequence of Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States, right? And in fact, when citizenship was granted to Puerto Ricans, at the same time, this came as a consequence of the Jones Act in 1917. In that same year, in another Jones Act, Congress, another Jones Act for the Philippine Islands. At the same time that Congress granted citizenship to Puerto Ricans, Congress maintained Filipinos as U.S. nationals. Since 1898 until 1917, both Puerto Ricans and Filipinos were U.S. nationals. And by the way, both could come into the United States freely. That's also, this is based on a U.S. Supreme Court decision, Gonzalez versus William, in 1904. But after 1917, this changed. While Puerto Ricans would remain able to move to the United States freely, for Filipinos remaining as nationals, this situation changed. And eventually, after 1934, after the Tidings-McDuffie Act, migration from the Philippine Islands would stop. In the landmark decision on citizenship for Puerto Ricans in 1922, in a case known as Balzac versus the people of Puerto Rico, the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, the Supreme Court ruled that, well, citizenship did not incorporate Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico remained as an unincorporated territory, that is, Puerto Rico. Even after Puerto Ricans became citizens, Puerto Rico remained a colonial territory. Even after 1917, not all constitutional rights would be extended to Puerto Rico, because even though they were citizens living in an unincorporated territory. And Taft argues that the only thing that changed is that Puerto Ricans, contrary to Filipinos, would have the right to enter the United States freely. So I argue that in this period, citizenship became a right of entry to the metropolitan territory. That is, after 1917, those that were not citizens would not have that right, and those that became citizens, like Puerto Ricans, would have the right to enter the United States. This is very important because it has determined Puerto Rican migration to the United States in a way that's very different from any other migration from a foreign country to the United States. That is the main difference between a transnational migration and a colonial migration, right? Migration comes as a consequence of colonialism and citizenship on the island. Now, let me go back to the role of the homeland state, which is something that Duane emphasizes. And again, in this case, even the role played by the homeland state, it's determined by the political relationship of Puerto Rico and the nature of Puerto Ricans as U.S. citizens. What I argue in my work is that in the 1940s, the Puerto Rican government was granted a relative autonomy over local affairs, right? More autonomy to implement economic policy. Eventually, it will be granted the right for self-government under the Commonwealth. But at the same time, right, during the same period in the 1940s and 50s, the colonial government began to play a more significant role in the organization of migration to the United States. And this is quite important in the Puerto Rican experience. Now let me, since I don't have time, let me just read a page or so of what I argue with regards to the role of the Puerto Rican government. Let me be very clear in stating that, like in the economic realm, the autonomy enjoyed by the colonial state in migration was also relative to what was allowed by the colonial relationship and by the metropolitan state. As happened with economic policy, Puerto Rico's migration policy was constrained by the limits imposed by the colonial relationship with the United States. For many years, even after the implementation of its migration law in 1947, Puerto Rican policymakers attempted to carry out migration plans to Latin America, plans that were repeatedly rejected by U.S. government officials and thus never accomplished. That is, the direction of the flow of Puerto Rican migration to the United States was not only determined by U.S. citizenship, but also by the limits imposed by the colonial subordination of the Puerto Rican government. Migration to the United States thus imposed a set of policy goals, like facilitating the incorporation of Puerto Rican migrants in the metropolitan territory and society, a job that private and state institutions in the United States were demanding that the Puerto Rican government should assume. Indeed, U.S. citizenship facilitated Puerto Rican migration to the United States. What was the nature of that citizenship as a colonial one, along with the cultural and ethnic makeup of the island migrants, which presented obstacles and imposed limitations to their full incorporation in the United States. The role played by the Puerto Rican government in facilitating the incorporation of its migrants in the United States reflects the contradictions and ambiguities of the colonial relationship with regards to migration. If indeed the status of Puerto Ricans as citizens and the status of Puerto Rico as a U.S. colonial territory facilitated migration to the metropolitan territory and made possible the intervention of the Puerto Rican government there, it was precisely because of the status of Puerto Ricans as colonial subjects that the colonial state had to intervene in order to advance and ease the incorporation in the U.S. mainland. Now, in order to conclude, let me just mention that after the 1970s, there's significant role in the movement of people from Puerto Rico to the U.S. since the 1940s until the 1970s. It basically ended after 1970, right, or the 1980s. Nowadays, the Puerto Rican government doesn't really play any role in the movement of people out of the island. That is, there is no homeless state, as in other transnational experiences, moving the people out. But, as we know, and as Centro has reported many times, the movement of people in the last 20 years is quite significant. That is, Puerto Ricans are moving out of the island without any push by the colonial government. And it's still a colonial government, by the way. That is, again, what allows and facilitates the movement of people from Puerto Rico is the political relationship of the island and the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans, right? And once we understand this, I think we will have a clear understanding of the Puerto Rican migration experience, not only for Puerto Rico, but also for the United States. Thank you.
Buenas tardes, good evening. Thank you for your presence here tonight. I had actually invited Edgardo to give his presentation because I think it dovetails very nicely with the presentation that I am going to make. This is based on a paper recently published in Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, and it is an article entitled Puerto Ricans, Citizens and Migrants, A Cautionary Tale. So it plays with many of the same elements that Edgardo has outlined in his own presentation. And by the way, there should be copies of the paper at the registration desk in case you care to read along or take it for your own reference at the end of the presentation. This article addresses limits to formal citizenship by tracing transformations in migrant political participation and how citizenship is exercised while migrating. It focuses on individuals' adaptations to changing political environments as they migrate and on the importance of how politics is structured in each polity. The analysis centers on Puerto Ricans because of how instructive their political experience may be for immigrants in the United States, and specifically those coming from Latin America. As U.S. citizens, Puerto Ricans have unrestricted access to the United States. However, their rights and practices of citizenship are circumscribed depending on whether they live in Puerto Rico or in the United States. Citizenship is not enough to participate in the governmental processes on equal footing with other members of the polity. Citizenship may be a necessary condition for full-fledged membership in a political community, but it's not sufficient. Puerto Ricans often figure as an anomaly in migration studies, as Edgardo had pointed out, as they are citizens of the country to which they migrate. Yet, they offer a vivid illustration of the limits to U.S. citizenship in the practice most associated with membership in a polity, political participation, which is defined as the activities of members of a political community to influence the structure of government, the selection of government authorities, and their policies. In spite of U.S. citizenship, full-fledged membership in this political community is limited for Puerto Ricans, given their low levels of political participation in the United States. However, their political participation in Puerto Rico is many times greater than in the United States. Yet, despite this greater political involvement, Puerto Ricans on the island cannot have a politically meaningful impact on the running of the federal government they are subject to as colonial possession. As U.S. citizenship for Puerto Ricans is a constant, it cannot explain their political involvement in either political system. What does substantially explain the difference in rates of political involvement is how politics is structured in each political community. Puerto Rico is very inclusive, at least for Puerto Ricans. The U.S. political system, on the other hand, has operated largely in a manner that has historically sidelined newcomers and marginalizes populations. A citizen is a constituent member of a political community, and political participation is the mechanism for self-government. Moreover, participation of members of such a polity is at the core of democracy in a society. Nevertheless, the existence of rights to participate in the process of self-governing does not mean that all members of the political community participate in equal measure, if at all. Thus, unequal involvement in the participatory process challenges the practice and the claim of democracy as a political community, as it does the standing of citizenship. People in Puerto Rico do not meet the ideal definition of U.S. citizenship put forth by political theorists, since residents of the island are not equal members of the democratic sovereign in North America that makes laws that apply to that Caribbean island. They do not participate on equal footing in the political and governance processes of such a sovereign. Even as citizens of the United States since 1917, the people of Puerto Rico do not have the right to vote for the President and Vice President of the United States or for representatives in the U.S. Senate, and only elect a non-voting representative who represents nearly 4 million people on the island. They have nevertheless developed practices of political participation in the island that match or exceed in proportion those in which citizens of the United States engage in North America. Turnout in elections in Puerto Rico consistently exceeds 70% of the voting age population, much higher than in the United States or in any country in which voting is not a compulsory requirement. High rates of electoral participation in Puerto Rico, which is a multiracial, highly differentiated along class lines but ethnically homogeneous society, are the result of political institutions that promote such participation. The political party system is highly competitive, with two leading parties alternating in power through strong and consistent mobilizations of their bases. The electoral process distinguishes itself from that of the United States as a mass phenomenon with important ritualistic overtones, strongly populist in nature, and with high party identification. And also, it has a strongly personalistic and very centralized and highly disciplined party system. Yet, if ideally not members of the U.S. sovereign, U.S. citizenship does enable the people of Puerto Rico to enjoy a membership right to reside within the United States proper. Currently, the Puerto Rican population in the United States, 4.6 million people, exceeds that of the island, which is about 3.8 million. But it is arguable whether free transit between Puerto Rico and the United States results in the ability to enjoy and exercise civil, social, and political rights in the United States. Over most of the 20th century, Puerto Ricans in the United States had not enjoyed the same privileges of memberships and inclusion in the collective identity of the United States. U.S. citizenship does afford Puerto Ricans membership benefits to which non-citizens are not entitled. The argument presented here is not that citizenship is in the whole society is unimportant. Rather, it is a sobering assessment to the outsized importance pegged to citizenship. After all, notwithstanding idiosyncrasies Puerto Ricans may have as citizen migrants, their political participation profile does not differ much from that of Latin American immigrants in the United States or other native-born Latinos. This similar profile is evident in political activities that take place in the United States geared towards influencing policy in the United States as well as transnational political activities. Such behavioral similarities make the experience of Puerto Ricans instructive insofar as citizenship practices are concerned. The political participation profile of Puerto Ricans in the United States contrasts markedly with that of the U.S. population as a whole and non-Hispanic whites in particular. Moreover, the political participation profile does not differ that much from the profile of other immigrants, rather other migrants from Latin America. And we can see here some data. This is derived from the Latino National Survey, in which we see that by and large, the pattern of participation for Puerto Ricans is pretty much similar to that of Hispanics as a whole, right? So Puerto Ricans are here, towards the middle of the table. This is the totals for all Hispanics. And this is just Hispanics in the United States. This is just Hispanics in the United States. What we see is that in some areas in this particular survey, Puerto Ricans do exceed perhaps the totals for the Hispanics as a whole in the country. They are still lower than for some Hispanic groups in the United States, for instance, Cubans perhaps, or generic Hispanics, people who say that they're Hispanic but do not denote any national origin preference. And using data from the current population survey, so a different survey, we can see that Puerto Ricans have a similar profile as the one shown in the previous slide, in which they contact public officials, they attend political meetings, or they take part in protest demonstrations at lower rates than the non-Hispanic population in the United States. So these Puerto Ricans, in terms of contacting elected officials or attending political parties or working for political campaigns, and their rates of participation are definitely lower than that for the non-Hispanic population, including non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks. And their profile appears very similar to the total Hispanic population, even though if it may be slightly larger. But nevertheless, Puerto Ricans fit the profile of other Latinos in the United States much more than non-Latinos in the United States. Thus, if Puerto Ricans, who are U.S. citizens, do not behave significantly different from other Latin American immigrants and native-born Latinos, and consistently participate at levels below non-Hispanics, then, I propose, what is the advantage of possessing the citizenship of the host society, the society these migrants settle in? I analyzed the exercise of Puerto Rican political membership through political participation by comparing contextually the political behavior of the same group of Puerto Ricans And there are elements, there are several elements to this contextual analysis. One is whether migrants are in Puerto Rico or in the United States. Do they participate the same way in Puerto Rico or in the United States? The same group of migrants. The second contextual analysis is based on how they behave within the United States and how they behave when they're in Puerto Rico relative to people who have never migrated. This is the analysis that I make in this presentation. And
Puerto Rican are not Spanish, because Spanish was a smaller number.
Puerto Ricans would, you have Puerto Rican Spanish speakers and Puerto Rican who are not Spanish speakers. Right? This includes Puerto Ricans regardless of whether they speak Spanish or not. This table shows several forms of political participation in Puerto Rico. And so we see that, for instance, in this particular sample, 91% of the sample was registered to vote in Puerto Rico. In the elections, over 70% of respondents to the survey had voted in the two previous election cycles. They had about a third had contacted elected officials, and so forth. We had a number of different outcomes. And on average, people in Puerto Rico engage in 3.65 activities. So if you add up all of these activities that were surveyed, the average participation was 3.65. If you exclude voting, which is of course the most common form of participation, people in Puerto Rico engage in 2 activities, roughly, right? And when you compare the participation of migrants on this column with non-migrants, even you may find some differences in outcomes. Those differences are not statistically significant. So Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, whether they're migrant or not or non-migrants, they behave politically in the same fashion. Okay? When we look at the sample of migrants, just these folks, and how they participated in the United States, we see some stark differences. If in Puerto Rico over 70% had participated in previous elections, in their election for president, or at elections for president, only 38% had turned out to vote. Only 21% had turned out to vote in local elections. 16% had turned out to vote, had turned out to go and speak with an elected official or written a letter of, spoken on the phone with them, as compared to 43% in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, 5%, I'm looking at the very bottom, had engaged in protest activity, whereas only 2% of these migrants had engaged in protest activities while in the United States. And again, in the summary indices at the very bottom, we see that whereas these migrants had engaged in 3.6 activities while they lived in Puerto Rico, they only had engaged in 1.6 activities while in the United States. A very significant difference. To establish and to make sure that these findings were not, there were not other factors affecting these findings, I ran a regression analysis that would control for a number of factors that have been known in the literature to affect political participation, such as education, such as income, age, gender, whether they were politically attuned to the political system, whether they were government employees, which in Puerto Rico, which has such a high rate of government employment, whether that had an impact on political participation. And at the very bottom of the models, 1, 2, 3, I have 3 variables that we explain the impact of migration on their political participation. And, to cut to the chase, migration had no impact whatsoever, even when holding constant other factors on their overall political participation. So whether you were a migrant or not a migrant, that did not have an impact on whether you behave politically one way or another in Puerto Rico. If you lived, say for instance in New York State, which in some areas it had, New York State is certainly the place that has, if not the oldest migration settlement of Puerto Ricans in the United States. That title belongs to Hawaii. But certainly the most, the continued largest settlement of Puerto Ricans in the United States, it still did not have an impact when they went back to Puerto Rico and participated in Puerto Rico. Similarly, if they went to new states of settlement, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, that did not seem to have any impact whatsoever on whether they participated in Puerto Rico differently. Okay? So how does migration affect the political behavior of migrants? And what are the implications of this migration effect for the practice of citizenship? Change in political environments given by migration resulted in marked changes in the political behavior of Puerto Rican migrants. The citizen migrants voted or contacted elected officials or signed petitions to address a problem in the community at rates that were much lower in the United States than when these same migrants engaged in the same activities in Puerto Rico. A very large proportion of migrants, nearly half, about 47%, disengaged completely from the political process in the United States. This is 47% of Puerto Rican migrants in the United States that later returned to Puerto Rico did not participate in any form of political activity while in the United States. These U.S. citizens were substantially less engaged in the United States, a location where they would presumably be uninhibited from exercising membership political rights by virtue of formal citizenship in such a political community. While migrants differed on the extent of their political involvement depending on whether they were in Puerto Rico or in the United States, these migrants exhibited no significant difference in political behavior from other Puerto Ricans when they returned to Puerto Rico. Their turnout rates, attendance to political meetings and rallies, and engagement in protest activity were no different from those Puerto Ricans who had never migrated. So it was in regards to the overall political participation, all forms of participation. It is as if the migration experience, a demobilizing one for nearly half of the migrants, had not had any effect, whether lasting or ephemeral, on the political behavior of these migrants. Returned migrants in Puerto Rico do not appear to be a distinct political group. They are certainly not politically different from other Puerto Ricans who have not migrated. A greater proportion of these migrants exercise their membership rights in the colonial circumscription in which they feel they belonged and within the collective identity that encompasses them. Paradoxically, their political rights of membership as U.S. citizens are severely circumscribed in that colonial jurisdiction vis-a-vis the ruling sovereign. On arriving in a new and inauspicious political environment, these political actors resisted the pressure from the political system to conform to expand patterns of participation. They readopted the prevailing pattern of political activity as they returned to their society of origin. The fact that these migrants became depoliticized on residing in a new polity speaks to the relative strength of political environments in shaping political behavior in relation to political socialization or prior political experience. Insofar as the exercise of citizenship is concerned, the experience these migrants, the citizen migrants, had in the jurisdiction where they were purportedly unfettered to engage in meaningful political activity shows that their reception in an unauspicious environment constrained their involvement in the political process. Their nominal citizenship offered little political capital. On their return to a more encouraging political milieu, where they see themselves and are seen as full-fledged members of the community, their involvement is distinct from that of other members of that polity. The context of reception and incorporation is different. In different political communities, conditions the extent to which newcomers actually become members on equal footing of the political community. Thank you very much. And we'll entertain some questions now. Yes, sir.
In America's entry into World War I, did that influence the passage of the Jones Act?
That's, so for me,
That point?
that's the standard version. Yeah, yeah, but again, I think we will have to consider other factors, right? I see citizenship as part of U.S. colonial policy, right? Once citizenship was established, Puerto Rico became internationally and domestically a U.S. territory. Also, several scholars have argued that citizenship became an anchor for U.S. rule on the island, a means of hegemony. And of course, it has solidified the relationship of Puerto Ricans to the United States, even until today, right? But I think the literature has overemphasized the strategic issues. I think there are other issues that we have to be aware that we should be looking at, right? That so far we haven't done. Definitely, citizenship was not used for conscription, right? My dear colleague Harry here has worked on that, right? The whole idea that Puerto Ricans were made citizens in order for making them serve in the armed forces, that definitely it's not a major factor in explaining this.
And it is precisely for that reason that I think that the Jones Act was not used to extend citizenship for Puerto Ricans, precisely because Puerto Ricans, did not serve by and large, or were not deployed rather in a theater of war once the war started. In addition to that, the Jones Act did not apply just to Puerto Rico. The Jones Act applied to several other jurisdictions under the purview of the United States. It may have treated Puerto Rico differently, as it did other jurisdictions under the United States at the time, all over which the Jones Act had effect. Yes, sir.
How do you explain that the activity in the U.S., Puerto Ricans, is 6 times smaller political activity as you show on the table than in Puerto Rico? Means, let's say Puerto Rican people are very local and only interested in something. What is
No.
the conclusion?
No, I mean, the conclusion is that, for instance, here in the United States, I compare the political, I emphasize the political system in Puerto Rico. I didn't do as well for the United States. If you take, for instance, the places where Puerto Ricans settled in the United States, they tend to be poor areas that were underserved both by the government and by the political parties. The political party system did not necessarily mobilize Puerto Ricans to the same extent that they mobilized Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. Number one. Number two, Puerto Rico is a highly contested 2-party system, which again is another incentive for Puerto Ricans to mobilize their vote. In New York City, for instance, is a 1-party system. New York City is a 1-party system. Puerto Rico is a highly contested and highly competitive 2-party system. You have institutional barriers for Puerto Rican participation in the United States. Up until 1965, with the Voting Rights Act, Puerto Ricans were subject to literacy tests before they could register to vote. After 1965, and still to this day, there are still many mechanisms by which Puerto Ricans are prevented from registering to vote. And I'm only looking at electoral avenues of participation, which are not the only ones. You also have to perhaps understand that as a people that are racially distinct, certainly at the time, they were racially and culturally distinct from the prevailing population in the United States. They did not fit the black-white dichotomy that was extant in the United States at the time. Elected officials, government officials did not know how to deal very well with Puerto Ricans and tended to ignore the Puerto Rican population, which also gave gave an opportunity for the government of Puerto Rico to intervene and assist
Indeed,
on
yeah.
their behalf.
And in Puerto Rico, you have two-party system, like majority.
You have a highly competitive two-party system, although you have more than 2 political parties. Ismael.
I have, for Edgardo, I have a question. The question is, how do you situate your arguments within the debates about if Puerto Rico is a nation or not? Because Tuani, when he uses transnationalism, it is my understanding that he's trying to explain those debates by saying that the government of Puerto Rico was using this cultural nationalism in a transnational way. And then my critique is that, you emphasize when you're talking about Puerto Rico getting autonomy, you're emphasizing about the limits and constraints, but what did this autonomy allow to that wasn't before like that? What was before this colonial government before 1948? How was it? And how was then after that time?
Let me answer the second question. The first one, I'm not very clear on what you're trying to say. In the 1970s and 80s, in trying to explain what happened during 1940s, right? The emergence and rise of the Popular Democratic Party and reforms that ended with the creation of the Commonwealth in 1952. Some people, mostly economists, argue that the colonial government gained some relative autonomy, right? They took this concept from Marxist and sociological debates going in Europe and the United States, and they applied to Puerto Rico, right? That the colonial government, which is a structure of the U.S., right? Everything is determined by Congress or by policies of the executive, right? Until 1948, the governor was appointed by the President of the United States, right? Also appointed the Supreme Court, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I argue is I take and redefine this concept of relative autonomy to argue that along with economic autonomy and political autonomy, right? But Puerto Ricans gained some measure of self-government through, particularly in the last years of the 1940s, that became codified in Commonwealth. My argument is that in the midst of all these events, one specific area that nobody really paid attention to is that the colonial government assumed a relative autonomy in terms of migration. That is, in 1947, 46, 47, there was this huge Puerto Rican problem in New York City, right? That massive entry of Puerto Ricans created a huge debate, right? And one of the issues was, who the hell is going to deal with those folks, right? Well, that's the second. First of all, are these folks citizens? How can they be, right? So how can we stop these people from coming in? And of course, in New York, some institutions argue that this should be a federal issue. Of course, the federal government never intervened due to one basic factor, right? They could not stop the movement of citizens from a U.S. territory to the United States. So at the end, the colonial government assumed this function of dealing with migration within certain restraints, right? One specific restraint which I have paid some attention is that even after the government approved the 1947 law, right, that created the migration law, the Bureau of Employment and Migration, you know a lot about that, the Migration Division in New York City. Even after that day, until the mid-1950s, the Puerto Rican government still was thinking about plans of migration to Latin America. Because some people within the party argue that, moving these folks to the United States will keep the Puerto Rican problem going on there, right? And our people would be better adapted in a similar culture and language in Latin America. And basically the main obstacles to those plans was the U.S. government. Because, of course, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, right? So again, we have to take into account what was going on at that time and the role that migration played. Because both the Puerto Rican elite and the U.S. government and elite wanted migration to happen, right? There was a need for cheap labor in the United States, in places like New York, right? And of course, the ruling elite in Puerto Rico wanted these people out of the island so they can, create economic and political stability on the island. And of course, at the end, all this benefited the U.S. regime on the island because migration, in fact, as many people have argued before, functioned as an escape valve, right? By allowing people to go out, things would remain calm in Puerto Rico. In fact, migration has always been an escape valve for colonialism, even to today, right? People are living in huge numbers today, so basically all the tension on the island is, it's move out. It's move out. What was the other question?
I mean, how do you answer to the people that take a nationalistic stance?
In what sense?
In the case of Puerto Rico, that Puerto Rico is a nation, because you are talking about colonialism and citizenship. So
I don't see a contradiction between Puerto Rico being a nation and being a colony and being a U.S. citizen. That's part of the Puerto Rican experience.
I'm just asking, what your stand is, because what Duane does is saying, you have transnationalism in the case of Puerto Rico because the government of Puerto Rico is promoting this nationalism, not just in the island, this cultural nationalism, not just in the island, but in Puerto Rican communities.
Well, I have a different take. From the things I've seen, the Puerto Rican government during the 40s until the 1960s and 70s was not promoting nationalism among Puerto Ricans here. They was promoting assimilation and incorporation because the government didn't want Puerto Ricans to go back. They wanted to settle in here and become, quote unquote, assimilated, right? But again, migration had a great impact on Puerto Rican society, right? In terms of education, infrastructure, the whole air transportation infrastructure is related to migration, right? The emphasis on English education in schools, and so on and so forth. So I think that for many years, scholars in Puerto Rico had underestimated the role that migration played in the post-war, in the post-war years in Puerto Rico.
The nation of Puerto Rico doesn't exist like Dominicans or some Dominican
What?
citizens.
Puerto Rico is not an independent country.
Yeah, it's still independent,
Puerto Rico is not independent.
not independent.
Not
No, it's not.
independent.
It's a U.S. territory of the United States,
US.
colonial territory of the United States.
Means nation not exist. Yeah. Already.
Andres.
Just a couple of points. Thanks for the presentation. Just on that last item, as late as 1980, right, Munoz Marin in an interview was saying, in another generation, Puerto Ricans will no longer, in the U.S. will no longer be Puerto Ricans, they'll be assimilated. So that meant that mindset that, they're not promoting the cultural nationalism. But on Carlos's presentation, I missed another variation of the question about migrants. Now, did you have in there the migrants who go back to the island?
Mhm.
And I understand what you said about comparatively to those who did not migrate, not much of a difference. But did their political participation increase comparative to their involvement here in the U.S.? In other words, their involvement here at a certain level, did it increase when they go back?
Yes,
It did.
yes. To the point that it was indistinguishable from other Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico.
Right, okay, good, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so while they were in the United States, their political participation was very low across the board in all forms of political participation. When they went back to Puerto Rico, it went back up to the level that it made them undistinguishable from other Puerto Ricans on the island.